The cellar of Blackthorn Manor smelled like rust and regret. Margaret had stopped counting the days 3 months ago, when the numbness became easier than the screaming. Her fingers, pale as bone, trembled as she adjusted the oil lamp, one of the few mercies her uncle allowed. The light caught the chains bolted into the stone wall, and her stomach twisted. Not her chains. His. The man in the corner hadn't moved in weeks. She knew this because she visited him every night when the manor slept and the world belonged only to the damned. "You should let me die," he'd whispered once, his voice like wind through a crypt. That was before the fever took his words. Now he lay motionless, his breathing so shallow she had to place her hand near his lips to confirm he still existed. Margaret was not a brave woman. She was 26 years old, a widow without children, returned to her uncle's estate after her husband's heart stopped in their marriage bed. That was 7 months ago. Her uncle, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, had called it God's mercy. Then he'd locked her in the East Wing and told society she'd gone mad with grief. It was madness that brought her to the cellar the first time. A key left carelessly on the kitchen table. A door she'd always wondered about. And in that moment, standing before the chained stranger, she understood that madness was sometimes the only door to salvation. He was impossibly beautiful in the way broken things are beautiful, all sharp angles and shadows. His skin held the pallor of someone who'd never seen sunlight, and his hair, black as cathedral glass, fell across his face like a veil. The chains wrapped around his wrists and ankles were silver. An odd choice, she'd thought, until he'd laughed, that first night, and said silver was the only thing that held him. "Why?" she'd asked, kneeling beside him in the darkness. "Because I'm not human," he'd answered, "and because Mercy was murdered the day I was born." His name was Adrian. He'd told her little else, but Margaret had learned patience in captivity. She'd learned that silence could be a conversation, that bringing water, wiping fever sweat from his brow, and simply sitting in the dark beside him was a language older than words. Tonight, she carried bread and the last of the cook's broth. Her uncle had dismissed half the staff. The house was bleeding money, he'd said, and Margaret was bleeding his patience. Good. Fewer eyes meant fewer obstacles between her and the basement door. Adrian's eyes opened as she descended the stairs. Even in fever, they held intelligence, sharp, haunted, and impossibly old. "You came back," he whispered. "I always do." She knelt beside him, and he tried to turn away. This was their ritual now, his refusal, her persistence, his shame, her grace. "Why do you waste yourself on a corpse?" he asked. His accent was faint, European perhaps, smoothed by centuries into something untraceable. "Because you're not a corpse." She pressed the spoon to his lips. "Because something in me recognizes something in you. Because being locked away with no one to see you is a special kind of death, and I would not wish it even on the man who locked me here." He drank. His hand, when it emerged from the chain's reach, trembled against her wrist. She felt it then, the pulse beneath his skin, rapid and desperate like a bird fighting its cage. "If I told you what I am," he said softly, "you would run. Then don't tell me yet." She withdrew her hand, but slowly. "Tell me when I'm strong enough to hear it." His eyes, were they darker than before? Or was it just the lamp casting shadows, fixed on hers? "You're already stronger than you know. That's what frightens me most." The cellar seemed to hold its breath. Outside, wind rattled the single high window. Inside, 2 captive hearts beat out of rhythm, learning to find a tempo that might someday become a waltz. Margaret rose to leave, as she always did before dawn. But this time, Adrian reached further than the chains allowed, his fingers grasping empty air between them. "Margaret," he said. It was the first time he'd spoken her name aloud. "When you free me, and you will free me, I see it in your eyes. Promise me you'll run." "Where would I run to?" "Anywhere. away from what I'm about to become. She didn't answer. Instead, she descended the stairs the next night with something she'd stolen from her uncle's desk. A small silver key, tarnished and ancient, no larger than a child's thumb. She'd found it wrapped in a letter addressed to a man she didn't know, a letter that spoke of debts unpaid and promises broken. Adrian watched as she approached. His fever had broken. His eyes were clear now, golden at the edges, as if lit from within. "Don't," he whispered, but his hand was already reaching toward the key. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." The lock surrendered with a sound like a prayer answered. The silver fell away from his wrist, and in that moment, in that singular, irreversible moment, his body went rigid. His eyes blazed amber, then crimson, then something between starlight and blood. When he looked at her again, he was no longer the broken man in chains. He was something infinitely more terrible. He was something infinitely more beautiful. And she had set him free. Chapter 2. The Awakening. The transformation lasted 17 seconds. Margaret counted them the way one counts during a lightning storm, not to measure time, but to measure distance from danger. 1. His spine arched, bones realigning with wet, organic sounds. 2. His skin darkened, veins becoming visible as if lightning ran beneath the surface. 3. His fingers lengthened, nails becoming something sharper, more animal. 4. His breath became fire. 5. A sound emerged from his throat, not quite human, not quite beast. 6. The chains, freed from their lock, fell away like autumn leaves. 7. His eyes opened, and they were not eyes anymore, but windows into something ancient and ravenous. 8. He fell forward onto his hands, his entire body trembling. 9. A roar, low, visceral, the sound of centuries contained in a single scream. 10. At 17, he went still. Margaret remained motionless, every instinct screaming at her to run. Her uncle's warnings echoed. The basement is forbidden. There are things down there older than God's mercy. She had thought he meant ghosts. Adrian knelt on the stone floor, his shoulders heaving, his new form both recognizable and foreign. He was taller, broader, his frame now carrying the weight of something that had lived through empires. His skin had taken on a luminescence, pale blue beneath the darkness like moonlight on water. His hands, long-fingered, elegant despite their ferocity, pressed against the stone as if grounding himself. When he looked at her, his eyes held layers, gold beneath the red, silver at the edges, and somewhere deep within, a human drowning. "Go!" he rasped. His voice had changed, deeper, resonant, speaking in harmonics her body felt before her mind understood. "Go now, while I still recognize you enough not to—" "Not to what?" she asked. He laughed, a terrible, beautiful sound, like glass breaking in reverse. "Not to see you as prey." But Margaret stepped closer instead. "You're afraid," she said, not a question. "I am terrified." He turned away, his hands balling into fists. She could see the effort it took, muscles rigid with restraint. "For 300 years, I have been caged by those who feared what I could become. Your uncle kept me here because even he, a man who trafficked in dark arts and older promises, understood that what I am is something that should not exist. And now you stand before me, wearing your widow's black like a death wish, and you ask me why I'm afraid?" "Yes," Margaret said. "I ask you that." He spun to face her, and for a moment she saw the killing thing inside him, the predator, the ancient, the eternal. Then his expression shattered like that reversed glass, and underneath was only anguish. "Because you smell like mercy," he whispered, "and I have not smelled mercy in so long that I've forgotten it has a scent." She reached out and touched his face. His skin was cold as cathedral stone, and it thrummed with a power that made her fingertips sing. In her touch, she felt his centuries, The weight of kingdoms built and burned, of loves lost to time, of a hunger that had become philosophy, of a loneliness so profound it had calcified into his very bones. "What are you?" she asked. "A king without a crown. A god with no one left to worship him. A monster who learned to read poetry, so he could understand why he should be ashamed of being alive." He caught her hand gently, careful of the claws that had emerged. "I am Adrian Valdris, of a bloodline so old that historians forgot to write it down. I was born human in an empire that no longer exists. I was made into this thing by a woman I loved, and I have spent centuries trying to forget her face." Why? Because every time I remember her, I remember that I chose to become this instead of staying human with her. I chose power. I chose immortality. I chose wrong. He released her hand, and she felt the loss like an amputation. "And now you're here, and you smell like the second chance I don't deserve." Margaret moved through the cellar then, gathering the chains, the broken manacles, the detritus of his captivity. When she turned back, Adrian was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. "We need to leave," she said. "My uncle will notice eventually. When he does, I will kill him." There was no anger in it, no drama. It was simply fact, stated as one might state that the sun rises. "Not for myself, but because there is no torture in this world sufficiently creative to pay for what he has done to you." "No," Margaret said. "We leave, we survive. That's how we win." Survival is not victory for creatures like me. We need absolution. Then we'll find that too. She extended her hand. "Can you walk?" "I can do more than walk. Little widow." He took her hand, and the touch sang between them. "I can run. I can fly. I can burn the world or rebuild it. I can do anything except undo what I have been. But perhaps—" His eyes, now more human but still luminescent at the edges, searched hers. "Perhaps that's enough." They climbed the cellar stairs as the first light of dawn broke through the windows. Behind them, the silver chains lay scattered like shed skin, glinting in the weak morning light. Ahead, the house slept, its secrets safe for one more night. But in the main bedroom, Margaret's uncle stirred. He had felt it, the shift in the manor's essence, the rupture in his carefully maintained spell. And when his eyes opened, they were not quite his own. They were golden and ancient and filled with centuries of rage. Chapter 3. The Hunter and the Hunted. The moors stretched endlessly in every direction, ancient, indifferent, belonging to nothing human. Margaret and Adrian had been running for 3 days now, and the landscape had become both sanctuary and grave. Every step took them further from Blackthorn Manor and deeper into a wilderness that didn't care if they lived or died. Adrian moved with unnatural grace, never tiring, his body finally free to express the power it had contained. Margaret, by contrast, was fading. Her feet had blistered days ago. Hunger had become a phantom limb, but she refused to slow, refused to burden him with her mortal weakness. "Stop," Adrian said on the evening of the 3rd day. They stood on a ridge overlooking a valley shrouded in mist. "You're dying." "I'm walking." She took another step, and her vision fractured at the edges. He caught her as her knees buckled, carrying her as easily as one might carry a book. His arms held no warmth. They were cold as grave earth, but they held her with a tenderness that made the ache in her chest sharper than any hunger. "I can end this," he said softly. "It would take only a moment, one bite, and you would never be tired again. Never be hungry, never be alone." Margaret understood what he was offering. It was the same offer that had destroyed him, according to his own confession. Eternity, damnation disguised as grace. "No," she whispered, "not even to be with me forever? Especially not for that." She looked up at his face, illuminated by the rising moon. "Forever is a long time to regret choosing wrong." He made a sound, something between a laugh and a sob, and set her down beside a copse of twisted trees. "You're wiser than gods, Margaret, wiser and more stubborn and infinitely more infuriating." "I'm exhausted," she corrected, "and I'm frightened, but I'm not wrong." He disappeared into the darkness. Hunting, she knew, though he'd never confirmed it. She told herself she didn't want to know the details of what he fed on. Ignorance was its own mercy. When he returned, he carried fire. Not literally. He'd gathered branches and used flint to create light and warmth. In the dancing flamelight, he seemed less monstrous and more simply other, a creature from a different order of creation, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "Your uncle is coming," Adrian said. It wasn't a guess. "I can feel him on the wind. He's not alone. He's brought others." "What others?" "Witches. Vampires. Things that serve him because they want power or because they have nowhere else to go." Adrian sat across the fire from her, the flames reflecting in his eyes like captured stars. "He's older than I am, Margaret. I didn't realize it at first. The chains, the weakness, they obscured it. But now that I'm free, I can taste it in the air. He's centuries old, and he's very, very angry." "Because I freed you?" "Because I was a tool, and tools that escape their masters are an existential threat." Adrian's expression hardened. "He kept me not just imprisoned but controlled. The chains were silver, yes, but there were other bindings, older magic, older blood. He was using me, feeding off my power to extend his own life. Every moment I was chained, he was growing stronger. Now that I'm free, his life is on a countdown." Margaret understood then. Her uncle hadn't kept Adrian as a prisoner out of cruelty alone. He'd kept him as a parasite keeps a host. "We need to confront him," she said. "No, we need to run. I can't protect you if we stay." "You're not protecting me by running. You're just delaying the inevitable." She sat forward, the cold no longer penetrating her determination. "He'll hunt us forever. That's what predators do. They don't stop until they've consumed what they're chasing." Adrian studied her across the firelight. "When did you become so fierce?" "When I realized that mercy isn't about being passive, it's about choosing to act despite the cost." The sound came then, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving fast, and underneath that, something older, the susurration of magic, words spoken in languages dead for centuries, prayers to gods that had never existed. Adrian stood. "Stay here. Don't move until dawn. If I don't return by then, I'm coming with you. You'll slow me down. Then I'll slow you down." She rose, swaying slightly but holding firm. "I didn't free you from one cage just to cage you in fear. We face this together, or we don't face it at all." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes. The immortal code warring with something new, something human, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "If you die," he began. "I won't, and neither will you." She reached out and took his hand. His skin was cold as death, but under her touch it warmed slightly, as if her mortality was a fire he'd forgotten how to feel. "You've been alone for so long that you've forgotten how to be otherwise. But you're not alone now. And I'm not weak. I'm tired, and I'm hungry, and I'm terrified. But I'm also someone who looked into a cellar and saw a broken king instead of a monster. That's worth something." The hoofbeats grew louder. Adrian pulled her close, and for a moment she thought he might try to run with her after all. Instead, he kissed her, chaste and desperate, tasting of blood and antiquity, and a longing so profound it echoed in her bones. "If we survive this," he whispered against her mouth, "I want to know what it feels like to be human again. With you, even if it's only for a moment." "We'll survive," Margaret said, "and we'll have 1,000 moments." The riders emerged from the mist then, silhouettes against the gray dawn light. At their head was a figure Margaret recognized, her uncle, but transformed. His eyes burned gold like Adrian's, and his form seemed to shift and flow like smoke given shape. Adrian stepped between Margaret and the riders, and in doing so became something other than the tender creature who'd just held her. He became the king he'd been born to be, ancient, powerful, beautiful in the way apocalypses are beautiful. Valdris, her uncle's voice was a rasp, a hunger-made sound. Still playing with mortals, I see. Still believing there's redemption in mercy. There is, Adrian called back, and you're about to learn why that terrifies you more than any weapon I could wield. Margaret, standing behind him, saw the moment everything changed. She saw it in the way the earth beneath them began to tremble. She saw it in the way the sky, which had been gray, suddenly bled crimson at the edges. She saw it in the way Adrian's power, finally, completely unleashed, began to reshape the world around them into something neither mortal nor immortal, neither mercy nor damnation, but something entirely new. If you've been captured by this story of forbidden redemption, leave a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And at what hour does this tale find you in the darkness? We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of night they haunt the hearts of those brave enough to listen. Chapter 4: The Price of Power. The moor had become a battlefield where the laws of physics went to die. Adrian's power radiated outward in visible waves, concentric circles of force that turned grass to ash and stone to powder. The sky above them had fractured, showing glimpses of places that didn't exist. Cathedrals and cities that had burned centuries ago. Gardens where flowers bloomed with light instead of color. Oceans that flowed upward instead of down. Margaret felt reality bending around her like fabric pulled too taut. She dropped to her knees, not in surrender, but in attempt to ground herself to something solid. The earth, even as it crumbled, was the only thing keeping her from dissolving into the spaces between moments. Her uncle and his riders had frozen mid-charge. They hung suspended in air as Adrian's power reached into them, and Margaret understood then what Adrian truly was. He wasn't just a king. He was something that had been old when kingdoms were invented, and his anger was the anger of a universe learning it had been betrayed. 300 years. Adrian's voice came from everywhere at once, from the air, the earth, the bleeding sky. 300 years of servitude, of watching you feed on my power while I slowly suffocated. You told yourself it was necessary, that I was too dangerous to roam free, that your control was mercy. Her uncle's form convulsed, his skin darkened, shadows spreading across it like an infection. I made you what you are, boy. I found you dying, broken, abandoned after you were cast out. You found a dying man and offered him damnation disguised as salvation. Adrian cut him off. Just as you offered my daughter the same lie centuries ago. Margaret's breath stopped. A daughter. Adrian had a daughter. Adrian turned then, and she saw something in his eyes that broke her heart. Sorrow so deep it had become geology, something that would never be truly exposed to light. She chose to stay human rather than join me in this prison. She loved me enough to die instead of becoming what I am. So I spent the next 300 years making sure no one could ever hurt her memory the way I hurt her by letting her choose between me and her own humanity. He turned back to her uncle, and the power around him intensified. The air itself began to burn. And then you trapped me. You used blood magic older than Egypt to chain me to this place. You knew that if I ever became aware of what you'd done, what you'd made of yourself by feeding on my power, I would... He stopped. I would, he repeated, and his voice fractured with something that wasn't rage, but its opposite. It was mercy. It was the terrible, beautiful choice to show compassion to something that didn't deserve it. And in that moment, Margaret understood what Adrian had been trying to tell her all along. The real prison wasn't the chains. It was the weight of immortality itself, the knowledge that even your rage, even your vengeance, even your justice would outlive everyone it touched. Adrian released them. Her uncle and his riders fell to the ground like puppets with their strings cut. They didn't rise. Their forms remained still, unbreathing, their eyes open but unseeing. Not dead, Adrian had made sure of that. They would remain conscious in that dark place between life and death, aware but unable to move, able to feel but unable to change anything they felt. It was a prison far more terrible than any chains. Adrian collapsed then, and Margaret ran to him. His form was flickering, oscillating between his human shape and something else, something vast and terrible and aching. She could feel him fragmenting, the effort of showing mercy draining the very essence of what kept him alive. "I can't hold this," he whispered. "If I stay here, if I remain in this form with all this power awakened, I'll burn through everything. The moor, the town below, maybe all of England. I need to—" His eyes locked on hers, and she saw the choice forming there. "I need to go back to sleep, to let someone chain me again, to let—" "No." Margaret grabbed his face between her palms, forcing him to meet her gaze. "No more chains, no more prisons. But there's another way." "There isn't. You know there isn't. Immortality is the curse. The only cure is to choose to be less than you could be," Margaret finished. "You're right, but I'm not asking you to sacrifice your power. I'm asking you to contain it, to bind it, not with chains, but with purpose." She was saying this and hoping it was true even as she spoke. The thought came to her fully formed, as if something had whispered it into being. Adrian was powerful enough to reshape the world, but he'd been shaped by loneliness into a creature that only knew how to destroy. What if instead she could remind him how to build? "Come with me," she said. "Come to a place where your power means something different, where you can heal instead of harm, where being immortal isn't a curse, but a gift you can use to help people who have no one else." Adrian looked at her the way one looks at an impossible dream. "You're asking me to choose to be human, even while immortal. I'm asking you to choose to be merciful, to be what you've denied being for 300 years, not because you have to, but because you can." The world around them was still flickering, reality still uncertain. But in Adrian's eyes, something steadied. The ancient cosmic rage gentled into something almost like tenderness. "If I do this," he said quietly, "if I bind my power to purpose instead of pain, I'll need an anchor. Something to remind me of who I'm trying to become on the nights when eternity feels too heavy and the hunger too vast." He was asking her to stay. He was asking her to be the thread that kept him tethered to humanity. "Yes," Margaret said. The moor stopped burning. The sky sealed itself. The corpses of her uncle and his riders lay frozen in their eternal awareness, a monument to the price of greed and the power of mercy. And Adrian, the Vampire King, made a choice that would echo through the centuries. He chose love over vengeance, purpose over power, and in doing so, he became something new. He became redeemed. Chapter 5: The Sanctuary. The monastery sat on a cliff overlooking the Irish coast, white stone rising from mist like a prayer answered in architecture. Adrian had built it centuries ago, in an earlier life, in an earlier version of himself. It had been abandoned for nearly 200 years, the monks who kept it finally dead, their legacy forgotten, their sanctuary swallowed by wilderness. Margaret climbed the stone steps in the first true light she'd seen in weeks, her legs still trembling with exhaustion and hope. Adrian climbed beside her, maintaining a careful distance, as if proximity itself was a temptation he wasn't sure he could resist. "The sun," she said, noticing that he wasn't burning, wasn't hiding. I thought— The curse of the sun is a myth, Adrian explained, his accent becoming more pronounced as he spoke of old things. Sunlight doesn't kill us, but it reminds us of what we've lost, the ability to age, to change, to truly be in the world. Most of my kind learned to fear it. I learned to fear what it made me feel. They entered the monastery through a door that opened at Adrian's touch, as if the building recognized its creator. Inside, everything was preserved as it had been left. Prayer books, with annotations in languages that no longer existed, candles in fixtures of wrought iron, stone floors worn smooth by thousands of footsteps seeking redemption. This was meant to be a sanctuary, Adrian said softly. A place where those who'd hurt themselves or others could come and find absolution. I made it because I was trying to believe that redemption was possible even for the damned. Then I lost faith in that possibility. I let myself believe that there was no mercy in the world, only hunger and time, and the slow erosion of meaning. But you're here now, Margaret said. So maybe you never lost faith. Maybe you just lost hope that you deserved it. Adrian looked at her, and she saw the strain it was costing him to be in this place. A place built on hope. A place infused with the memories of his attempts at grace. In this room, he gestured to the main hall, a vast space where sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. I sat for 40 years trying to understand if immortality was punishment or gift. I came to no conclusion. I only knew that I was too tired to live and too afraid to die. They moved through the monastery, and Adrian showed her rooms where the sick had been healed, chambers where the dying had been comforted, gardens where beauty had been tended like prayer. Each room told a story of a man who'd wanted desperately to believe in mercy, even as he doubted his own capacity for it. In the highest tower, they found what had brought Adrian here, a library. Thousands upon thousands of books, each one catalogued in Adrian's own hand, each one containing knowledge accumulated across centuries. Medical texts from ancient Persia, philosophers from Rome, poets from every age and nation. A vast repository of human wisdom, preserved not for its own sake, but as evidence that life, finite, fragile human life, contained beauty worth remembering. This is why I built this place, Adrian said, running his fingers along the spines of centuries of accumulated thought. Because I believed that if I collected enough beauty, enough wisdom, enough proof that humans were capable of more than cruelty and greed, maybe I could convince myself that being immortal served some purpose beyond mere survival. Margaret picked up a book at random, a collection of poetry in Portuguese, annotated in what she recognized as Adrian's handwriting. The marginalia were personal, intimate, reactions to beauty, arguments with philosophy, confessions of longing. "You read this?" she asked. "I read everything," Adrian said. "For centuries I read, hoping that somewhere in the accumulated genius of human civilization, I would find a reason to stop wanting to die." "Did you?" He looked at her then, and the answer was written across his ancient face. "No, until 3 days ago." The implication hung between them like a sword that hadn't fallen. Margaret set the book down carefully. "You're saying I'm why you want to live?" "I'm saying that for 300 years I've been a monument to my own suffering. I became a king of the damned, not because I wanted to rule, but because ruling was easier than feeling the weight of my choices." He moved toward the window, where the last light was fading from the western sky. "You freed me from chains, yes. But you did something more difficult. You freed me from the belief that redemption was impossible. You showed me that mercy isn't weakness. It's the only strength that lasts." "Adrian, I need you to know something," he continued, and his voice held the weight of centuries. "What you're asking me to do, to choose humanity while remaining immortal, to bear this power without wielding it as a weapon, it's not a gift I'm giving you. It's a burden I'm placing on you. You'll be tethered to me now. You'll watch everyone you love die. You'll eventually watch societies crumble and be rebuilt, and the only thing keeping me sane through that endless time will be you." Margaret moved to him and took his hand. His skin was cold, but now it didn't frighten her. It was simply the texture of eternity. "Then we'll be tethered to each other, and when I die, don't say that. When I die," she continued firmly, "you'll remember that I chose this, that I walked up those stairs with full knowledge of what loving you would cost. And maybe that will be enough to keep you human, until the next person finds their way to you, until the next person needs mercy. That's what this place was always meant to be, isn't it? Not a monument to your suffering, but a lighthouse for everyone else's." Adrian pulled her close, and for the first time, his embrace wasn't cold. It carried warmth, not heat, but the warmth of connection, of shared purpose, of the singular grace that comes when two broken things choose to heal each other instead. "I've spent so long being afraid," he whispered into her hair, "afraid of my power, afraid of what I'd do if I let myself feel, afraid that loving anyone would just repeat the tragedy of my daughter. But standing here with you, I'm only afraid of one thing." "What?" "That I'll wake up and find this was just another dream, that mercy was something I imagined to keep myself sane during the centuries of darkness." Margaret pulled back enough to look at him. In the deepening twilight, with the monastery around them and centuries of human wisdom shelved at their backs, she made a choice that echoed through time. She kissed him, slowly, deliberately, in a way that tasted like decision and consequence and love that knew exactly what it was choosing. "I'm real," she said, when they finally parted. "And so is this. So is your redemption. Adrian Valdres, you've been given a second chance. So have I. Let's spend the next, however long that takes, actually believing in it." He held her then, and for the first time in 300 years, the Vampire King wept. Not with grief or rage, but with the overwhelming relief of someone who's finally put down an impossible burden and found it didn't have to be carried alone. Outside, the Irish sun set, painting the coast in shades of gold and red. Inside, in the library of a sanctuary built by a man who'd wanted to believe in mercy, two people who'd been chained in different ways discovered that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a decision. It was a choice made every morning to be less than you could be, so that those you loved could be more. Chapter 6. The visitors. The first ones arrived on a fog-thick morning in autumn. Margaret was in the monastery's garden. What had been an overgrown ruin when they arrived was slowly becoming something intentional again, something alive. She had her hands in soil when she felt Adrian tense, felt him pause mid-breath, felt his attention snap outward toward the main gate. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Someone in pain. By the time Margaret reached the courtyard, Adrian had already opened the gates. Standing there, silhouetted against the mist, was a woman, mid-50s perhaps, though exhaustion had aged her skin. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, and blood had dried on her temple. Behind her came others, a young man with puncture wounds that suggested infection, an elderly priest with fever-bright eyes, 3 children clinging to each other like survivors of shipwreck. "We were told," the woman gasped, collapsing to her knees. "We were told that there was a place, a sanctuary. Someone said if we could find the monastery on the Irish coast, there would be help. There would be—" She looked up at Adrian, and Margaret saw recognition spark in her eyes. Not of him specifically, but of what he was, what he represented. A creature that should have brought terror instead brought something that looked dangerously like hope. Adrian moved toward her, and Margaret held her breath. This was the test, wasn't it? This was the moment where the king would show whether redemption was real or just a pretty story they'd told themselves in the dark. He knelt beside the woman with a gentleness that made Margaret's heart ache. He touched her broken arm with reverent care, and she gasped, not in pain, but in something more profound. The bones, misaligned for days, realigned beneath his touch. The hemorrhaging inside the joint that had been slowly killing her simply stopped. "What are you?" she whispered. "Someone who knows what it means to be broken and left for dead," Adrian answered. "Come inside, all of you. We have food, rest, and medicine. We have whatever you need to heal." Over the next weeks, the monastery was no longer a sanctuary in theory. It became one in fact. Adrian moved through its corridors like a ghost made tangible, his centuries of collected knowledge suddenly having purpose. He used herbs grown from seeds centuries old. He employed techniques of blood work and bone setting taught to him by physicians dead for 500 years. He spoke in languages patients didn't know they understood, calming fever dreams with words that carried the weight of authority. And Margaret discovered that his redemption had never been about becoming less powerful. It had always been about choosing to use that power in service of something beyond himself. The woman with the broken arm, her name was Catherine, was the first to truly recover. A week after her arrival, she could move without pain. 2 weeks later, the fever had broken, the infection arrested, her body remembering how to be whole. "I have to know," Catherine said one morning, finding Margaret in the library while Adrian was attending to the priest. "What he is. I know it's not human. I know it shouldn't be able to do what he did to my arm in moments of touching it." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about Adrian's confession, about the weight he carried of being something that should terrify her, something that by every rational measure was monstrous. "He's someone," Margaret finally said, "who's had a very long time to learn how to help instead of harm. That's all you need to know. That's all any of us need to know." But Catherine wasn't satisfied with that. On the evening before she was strong enough to leave, she found Adrian in the tower library, and Margaret, watching from a distance, saw them speak. Adrian's face cycled through emotions, resistance, explanation, shame, and finally, something that looked like peace. When Catherine left 3 days later, she carried with her a letter sealed in wax. She never opened it. Adrian had made that clear with a gesture. But whatever was in that letter, it was important enough that Catherine guarded it like a holy relic. More came after that. A boy with a curse mark that Adrian recognized as blood magic, which he systematically and patiently unraveled. A woman fleeing an abusive situation who simply needed a place to be safe and heal. An elderly man with cancer, for whom Adrian could offer no miracle, but offered instead a kind death, with dignity and mercy. It became clear to Margaret that this had always been Adrian's true nature, not the monster, not the king. He was a healer wearing the flesh of something lethal. He was a priest who'd lost his faith and then found it again in the most unlikely form, in the choice to serve those who had no one else. One night, after a particularly exhausting day spent helping the young priest recover from the fever that had been destroying him, Adrian collapsed beside the dying fire in the main hall. Margaret found him there at midnight, his immortal form folded into the armchair like a mortal man bearing mortal exhaustion. She didn't wake him. Instead, she covered him with blankets and sat vigil as the fire died to embers. This was the real redemption, she realized. Not grand gestures or cosmic battles, just an immortal creature choosing, night after night, to use his endless years in service of finite lives. In the morning, Adrian found her still there, asleep against his shoulder. "You should be resting," he murmured, not moving. The guilt in his voice was automatic, that old pattern where he equated love with burden. "I am resting," Margaret corrected. "This is what rest looks like for me now. It looks like knowing you're still choosing humanity. It looks like sitting beside you while you sleep, confirming that you're real and present and choosing this." Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Do you know what I realized last night, when I was helping that boy with the curse mark? I realized that for the first time since becoming immortal, I didn't measure the cost to myself. I just helped. I just gave. I didn't calculate what it would take out of me because the joy of actually helping someone was enough. That's redemption, Margaret said. That's mercy, Adrian corrected gently. Redemption is what happens when mercy finds someone who thought they didn't deserve it. As autumn turned toward winter, more visitors came. Some stayed days, some weeks. The monastery, which had been Adrian's monument to his own despair, became what he'd originally intended, a sanctuary, a lighthouse, a place where the broken could come to heal and understand that even creatures of darkness could choose to carry light. Like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance at mercy. Chapter 7. The Cost of Eternity. Winter arrived like a curse written in ice. Margaret had known in some abstract way that she would age. That mortality was the price of loving someone immortal, the trade-off for his choice to be human. But understanding it intellectually and experiencing it were entirely different geometries of pain. She noticed it in her hands first, the liver spots appearing overnight, the skin thinning, becoming papery. Then her knees began to creak in ways they hadn't before. Her breath came shorter after climbing the monastery's stairs. Her hair, which she'd worn long since arriving, began to silver, and then, in a progression that felt like betrayal, to white. Adrian noticed before she did. She saw it in the way he looked at her, the sudden flinching of understanding in his ancient eyes. "No," he said one morning, tracing the lines that had appeared around her mouth. "No, this isn't right. You weren't supposed to age so quickly. The sanctuary, there should be protections." "There are protections," Margaret said quietly. "They're protecting the people who come here to heal. I gave my consent to that, remember? When I asked you to bind your power to purpose instead of sustenance?" Adrian pulled away from her like she'd burned him. "I didn't agree to that. I didn't ask you to age yourself to death. You didn't have to ask. I chose it." Margaret rose and followed him to the window, where the Irish coast was hidden beneath gray skies and grayer seas. "Every day that you use your power to heal, you're not using it to extend your own immortality. Every ounce of energy you give to the sanctuary is an ounce you're not using to keep me as I was. I understood that when I agreed to this." "Then we end it," Adrian said, and his voice held the desperation she hadn't heard since his imprisonment. "We close the sanctuary. We leave. We find a way to live for ourselves instead of for—" "No." Margaret was firmer than she'd ever been. "No, Adrian. We don't get to do that. This is what you needed. This is what I needed. The cost is that I'll age and die. And you'll remain. The mercy is that I'll die knowing I mattered. That I helped matter. That I made your redemption real by witnessing it." "I can't watch you die," Adrian whispered. "I've watched everyone die, everyone I've ever loved. I can't, I won't." "Yes, you will," Margaret said, and she took his hands and placed them on her face. "You will, because you promised me that you'd be human while you're immortal. Humans watch people die. Humans survive loss and keep living. That's not a curse, Adrian. That's the most human thing there is." The winter deepened. Margaret could feel her time accelerating, not in some dramatic, supernatural way, but in the simple, inexorable march of mortality finally catching up with someone it had been pursuing all along. The sanctuary remained full. The sick continued to come, and Adrian continued to heal them, each act of mercy costing him something precious, years of her life, measured in the spending of his power. She didn't blame him for it. How could she? Every person he healed was someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's reason to live. How could she ask him to choose her over that? Love, she was learning, wasn't about sacrifice so much as recognizing that all of life was made of choices that cost something. One night, in the Tower Library, Adrian found her reading the poet books, the ones he'd been annotating for centuries, still searching for meaning in measured words. "I've been thinking," she said, not looking up, "about what you said the night you were released from the chains. You said that every immortal was once someone who chose not to die. I think that's only half the truth. I think every immortal is also someone who had to choose to keep living after everyone else was gone." "Margaret, let me finish." She closed the book and looked at him. She was beginning to see the man he'd been, the king, underneath the lover he'd become. "I've been thinking about your daughter, about how you spent 300 years haunted by her choice to die rather than join you, and I think I understand now. She wasn't rejecting you. She was choosing the one mercy that was available to her, the mercy of an ending, the mercy of not having to watch the world change forever." Adrian sat down heavily. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe when my time comes, I won't ask you to make me immortal. Maybe I'll ask you to do something harder." Margaret reached out and took his hand. "Maybe I'll ask you to let me go, to accept that some people are meant to be temporary, and that's not a tragedy. It's grace. It's the only mercy we mortals truly have, the knowledge that our endings are written, and that means our lives are precious in a way infinite lives can never be." "I won't let you go," Adrian said, but his voice wavered. "I can't." "You will," Margaret said gently, "because you'll have learned by then that love isn't about holding on. Love is about honoring the choice someone makes about their own existence, even if that choice is an ending." She could see him struggling with this, see the war playing out behind his ancient eyes. Immortality was the ultimate curse precisely because it trained you to believe that endings were tragedies. It took a kind of wisdom he hadn't accessed yet to understand that some endings were mercies. In the weeks that followed, Adrian subtly shifted. He stopped holding her at arm's length, as if her aging was a plague that might spread. Instead, he held her close, not as if she might break, but as if she was precious, finite, worth touching because her time was limited. He ran his fingers through her now white hair as if memorizing the texture, the color. He looked at her face, lined now, her eyes set deeper, her expression worn by the gravity of living, as if every wrinkle was a memory he wanted to preserve. "Tell me how it feels," he asked one evening. "Tell me what aging is like for you." Margaret thought about this seriously. "It feels like time is finally real. When you're young, you believe you have forever. You waste it. You make promises you don't keep, love people carelessly, assume there will be time to do everything later. But aging..." She looked at her hands, still functional, but visibly failing. "Aging is time becoming concrete. It's realizing that there isn't forever, that every moment I choose to spend with you is a moment I'm choosing not to spend on something else. It makes the moment precious." "That sounds like torture," Adrian whispered. "It is," Margaret agreed. "But it's a good torture. It's the torture of being alive, and you've been missing that, haven't you? That sense of cost. When you live forever, nothing costs anything, because you always have more time. But I'm running out. Every day I age is a day that the end gets closer, and that makes every day mean something." She could see him understanding this, not accepting it yet, but understanding. Beginning to grasp that maybe, just maybe, mortality wasn't a curse, but a feature that made existence bearable. By spring, Margaret could barely climb the stairs to the tower library. Her body had become an unfamiliar country, one she was learning to navigate with increasing slowness. Adrian was with her constantly now, carrying her when she needed carrying, sitting beside her in the garden where they'd first worked the soil together. "When it happens," Margaret said one morning, her voice thin as paper, "I want to be here, in the sanctuary. I want to die in a place where mercy is real, where I helped make mercy real." Adrian didn't answer. He just held her hand, and they watched the Irish coast together, eternal, unchanging. indifferent to their human drama. Chapter 8. The Eternal Choice. Spring turned to summer, and Margaret Valdres, she'd taken his name 4 months earlier in a quiet ceremony witnessed by the sick they'd healed together, lay dying. It wasn't dramatic. There was no fever, no sudden collapse. It was instead the slow, inevitable pulling away of someone who's lived a full life and is finally ready to rest. Her body simply began to fail, systems shutting down as if they'd been on borrowed time all along, which, of course, they had been. Adrian sat beside her bed in the room that overlooked the garden they'd planted together. He didn't sleep anymore, though he'd given up the pretense of needing to centuries ago. He just watched and waited and held her hand. "Are you afraid?" Margaret asked on what would be her final evening. Her voice had become whisper-thin, barely audible even in the stillness of the sanctuary. "Terrified," Adrian admitted. He, who'd faced armies and curses and centuries of solitude, was undone by the simple fact of her leaving. "After you, I'll be alone again, and I know myself well enough to understand what that means. The darkness will come back, the hunger, the questioning of whether existence is worth maintaining." Margaret squeezed his hand, the movement barely perceptible, her strength nearly gone. "No, you won't be alone. You'll have everyone you've healed, this sanctuary, the knowledge that you helped people despite the cost to yourself. That's not nothing, Adrian. That's everything." "It's not the same." "No," Margaret agreed. "It's not. It's harder, because it requires you to believe in meaning when you can't see it as clearly. It requires faith that your choices mattered even after I'm gone." She paused, gathering breath like it was a luxury she could barely afford. "Will you promise me something? Anything. When I'm gone, don't stop healing. Don't let the grief become an excuse to retreat back into yourself. And if, someday, someone else comes, someone who needs you, someone who can see past the monster to the healer beneath, don't be afraid to let them in." Adrian's voice broke. "I can't imagine wanting anyone else." "I know." Margaret managed a small smile. "That's what makes you human. But immortality has a long arc, Adrian. You'll change. You'll heal. And maybe someday you'll find room in your heart for another person who can remind you why living matters." As midnight approached, Margaret's breathing became more labored. The sanctuary seemed to hold its breath with her. Outside, the wind stilled. The ocean became glass. Even the stars seemed to lean closer, as if bearing witness. In her final minutes, Margaret's eyes opened wide. They held clarity, the kind that sometimes comes at the threshold of death when the veil thins and you see things others don't. "Adrian," she whispered, "do you see them?" He didn't see anything but her face, beloved and fading. "See what? Everyone you've healed, everyone you've loved across the centuries. They're here. They're all here, waiting." Her voice became stronger, younger somehow, as if aging was reversing as she approached the end. "And they're not here to judge you. They're here to thank you, to show you that mercy ripples across time. That every person you chose to heal spread that choice to others. You changed the world, Adrian. You changed everything because you chose redemption." "Don't leave," he begged. But it was a plea to something vast and unchangeable. Death, that most democratic of masters, would not listen. "I have to," Margaret whispered. "But Adrian," her eyes found his one final time. "Tell them. Tell everyone who comes after me that I chose this. That I chose to be finite with an immortal. That I chose to love someone who would outlive me. That I chose you. Tell them that love isn't measured in forever. It's measured in meaning. And ours meant something." She exhaled, and then she wasn't there anymore. There was no light leaving her body, no dramatic transformation. There was just the simple, profound absence of a person. The way a room becomes empty when someone passes from it. The world, suddenly, had one less human in it. Adrian sat with her body through the night, through the dawn, through the entire next day. The sanctuary's other residents didn't approach. They seemed to understand that something sacred was occurring, something that required distance and silence. When he finally rose, 3 days later, Adrian looked different. His immortal face held a new kind of age, not the aging of years, but the aging of loss, of understanding finally what it meant to be permanently changed by someone's absence. He buried Margaret in the garden they'd created together. The monks, for by that time there were monks again, a new order dedicated to continuing her and Adrian's work, helped him build a marker from Irish stone. He inscribed it himself in Portuguese, the language she'd been born speaking. Here lies Margaret Valdres, who saw a king in a cellar and freed not his chains, but his soul. She lived finite years in love with infinity, and in doing so, made eternity worth living. The sanctuary continued. More came seeking healing, and Adrian gave it. Each act of mercy measured now in the knowledge that it honored Margaret's sacrifice. The monastery, which had once been a monument to his despair, became a living thing. Schools were built. A library was expanded. People came from across Europe, then across the world, seeking the sanctuary where a creature of darkness had learned to carry light. Centuries passed. Adrian watched empires rise and fall. He watched medicine advance, watched humans learn to heal each other in ways that would have seemed miraculous in Margaret's time. He watched wars and genocides and the small, quiet kindnesses that always persisted despite them. And sometimes, on nights when the weight of eternity pressed too heavily, he stood in the Tower Library and read the old poetry books, the ones Margaret had loved. He read them in every language he'd learned across the centuries, and he heard her voice in every verse about mortality and meaning, about the terrible beauty of endings. One night, in the year when the world had learned to split atoms and dream of stars, a young woman arrived at the sanctuary with fever-bright eyes and a fractured heart. Adrian saw in her the same brokenness he'd recognized in Margaret all those years ago. That quality of someone who'd been worn down by life, who'd been told she was worthless, who was looking for a reason to keep living. He looked at her, and he felt something shift in the weight of his centuries, a lightening, a possibility, the first glimmer, after so long, of hope. And as he reached out to heal her, as he felt the old power flow through him in service of mercy, Adrian understood what Margaret had been trying to tell him on her deathbed. Love wasn't about forever. It was about choosing, in each moment, to matter to someone else. It was about grace given when it wasn't deserved. It was about the terrible, beautiful choice to see the divine in the broken and choose redemption. He had 300 years of darkness behind him, and he had eternity of light ahead, as long as he kept choosing it. As long as he kept remembering that every immortal was once someone who'd chosen not to die, and that the real miracle was learning to choose to live, fully, radically, redemptively alive for the people around them. The sanctuary's lights burned through the Irish night, visible from the ocean, a lighthouse for everyone lost in their own darkness. And inside, an ancient creature kept a simple vigil, honoring the dead and healing the living, understanding at last that this was what it meant to be human, even when dressed in immortal flesh. This was what mercy looked like. This was what redemption felt like. This was what love meant when you finally understood that forever was less important than now. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. Comment eternal if you trade your soul for love that heals, like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance at redemption. Follow for more immortal confessions born from blood and mercy, for stories where darkness learns to carry light, where eternity is redeemed by finite love. Because every immortal was once someone who chose not to die, and some of them, if they're very lucky, become someone who chooses to live.